didn't come to my college graduation. Not my father, not my stepmother, not my half-brother. Nobody. I stood in that gymnasium in my cap and gown, scanning the bleachers the way you do when you're still holding on to some small, stupid hope. Row after row of strangers' faces, parents crying, dads holding up phones to record, grandmothers clutching programs, and then there was the section where I'd reserved 2 seats just in case, even though they'd already told me they weren't coming. Both seats were empty. My roommate's mom took a photo of me afterward. She hugged me and said congratulations and meant it, even though she'd never met me before that afternoon. I smiled for the picture. I kept smiling. I was good at that by then. My father had called the week before, not to say he'd be there, to tell me he wouldn't. It's a long drive, he said, and honestly, Noelle, a degree in urban planning isn't exactly something to move mountains over. He said it the way you'd say the weather is what it is. Just a fact. Just a thing in the world. My stepmother had said something similar when I'd told them I'd been accepted 2 years earlier. She'd looked at my father over the dinner table and said, "Well, let's hope she can do something with it." Like I wasn't sitting right there. Like I was a project they'd already half given up on. I grew up in that house from the time I was 8. My mother died when I was 7, a car accident on a wet highway in November. My father remarried 14 months later. I was in 2nd grade and I remember thinking that 14 months felt like nothing, like no time at all. But I didn't have the words for it then. I just knew something had shifted and I couldn't shift it back. My stepmother wasn't cruel in the obvious way. She didn't lock me out of rooms or forget to feed me. She was more precise than that. She would look at my half-brother's drawings on the refrigerator and say nothing about my report cards on the counter. She planned family vacations during my school events. She remembered his allergies, his teachers' names, his best friend's birthday. For me, she had a kind of polished indifference that, over years, became its own language. My father followed her lead. I think he told himself that treating us equally meant treating me the same as a child who had always been fully wanted. It didn't work that way. I left for college in Pennsylvania on a Tuesday. My father shook my hand at the door. My stepmother said, "Don't forget to call." My half-brother was watching TV in the other room. I carried my bags to the car my mother's sister had helped me buy, and I drove 4 hours north, and I cried for about the first 2 of them, and then I stopped, and I told myself that this was the beginning of something, not the end. I meant it. I worked 2 part-time jobs through school. I tutored underclassmen in environmental policy. I applied for every grant and scholarship I could find. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, Constance, called me every Sunday. She'd moved to Portland years ago, and we couldn't see each other often. But she called every single Sunday, and she asked real questions, and she remembered what I'd told her the week before. She was the one person who made me feel like I existed in a continuous way, like there was someone keeping track. She came to my graduation. She drove from the airport in a rental car, and she sat in those bleachers by herself, and she cheered loud enough that I could hear her specifically from across that gymnasium floor. She took me to dinner afterward at a place with cloth napkins, and she ordered a bottle of champagne and gave a toast that made me cry in public, which I do not do. That night she told me, "Your mother would have been insufferably proud of you." I've thought about that sentence almost every day since. I got a job 4 months after graduation with a mid-sized urban development firm in Philadelphia. I was good at it, not in a modest, aw shucks way. I was genuinely good at it. I had a way of seeing how spaces could work that my supervisor said he didn't often find in people my age. I got promoted after 18 months. Then again, 2 years after that, I bought my own apartment at 29. 1 bedroom, 3rd floor, good light, a block from a coffee shop I liked. I furnished it slowly, the way you do when you're paying for things yourself and you want them to actually be right. I had a life. It was mine. It fit me. I didn't call my father often. A few times a year. His birthday, Christmas, the occasional Sunday when the guilt got loud enough. The conversations were short and careful, like walking on ice neither of us would admit was thin. He would ask about work in a vague way. I would answer in a vague way. My stepmother would sometimes get on the line and make small talk about my half-brother, who was in high school by then. who apparently wanted to study business, who was by her account destined for great things. I said the right things. I hung up. I went back to my life. I was 31 when everything changed. The change came, like so many unwanted things do, in the form of a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon. It was my father. He asked how I was. He asked about the apartment. He mentioned the weather. And then he said, "We've been talking as a family, and we'd love to have you come home for a weekend soon. There are some things we'd like to discuss." "What kind of things?" I asked. "Things it would be better to talk about in person," he said. I knew. I don't know how, but I knew. The careful tone. As a family. The specific use of the word home, as if that word were neutral. I told him I'd check my schedule and let him know, and I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen for a while, just staring at the cabinet above my sink. I called Constance. She listened to the whole thing and then she said, "You don't have to go." I knew that. But I also knew I would. Some doors you have to open yourself just to confirm what's behind them. I drove down on a Saturday in March. The house looked the same. Smaller, maybe, the way places you've grown up do when you come back as an adult and realize the rooms were never as large as your childhood made them feel. My stepmother opened the door and hugged me with both arms, which she had never done when I lived there. My father made coffee. My half-brother, who was 20 now, nodded from the couch and went back to his phone. We sat at the kitchen table. My father had a folder. He told me my grandfather, his father, had passed away 6 weeks earlier. I hadn't known. Nobody had called to tell me. I said, "I didn't know he passed." My stepmother said, "It happened quickly. We didn't want to upset you." I looked at my father. He looked at the folder. He told me that my grandfather had left behind a significant estate. Investments, property, savings accumulated over 40 years of careful living. He told me that as the oldest grandchild, which I was, by 7 years, I had been named in the will in a substantial way. And then he told me what they wanted. They wanted me to contribute a portion of my inheritance to a college fund they were setting up for my half-brother. They framed it as keeping it in the family. My stepmother said my grandfather would have wanted it. She used phrases like, "We all pitch in and you've never had dependents and you're doing so well on your own." My father nodded at each sentence like they were rehearsed, because they were. I sat there and I thought about the 2 empty seats at my graduation. I thought about 14 months. I thought about every Sunday I'd spent in that house feeling like furniture. I thought about my roommate's mother taking my photo because no one else was there to do it. I said, "No." My stepmother blinked. My father looked up from the folder. "No," I said again. "I'm not going to do that." The drive home was quiet in a way that felt clean. I called Constance from a rest stop. She said, "Good." I heard nothing for 3 weeks. And then I heard from their attorney. They were contesting the will. Their argument, drafted and filed with actual legal letterhead, was that my grandfather had been suffering from cognitive decline at the time the will was written, and that undue influence had been exerted, by me apparently, in conversations I'd had with him, though they couldn't specify which conversations because there hadn't been any of the kind they were describing. I had spoken to my grandfather maybe 6 times in the last 2 years of his life. He had called me on my birthday. We had talked about my work, about urban development, about a housing project I was involved with downtown. He had said he was proud of me. That was it. That was the whole of my supposed scheme. I hired an attorney. Her name was Patel, and she was efficient and calm in the way that very good lawyers often are, like someone who has already seen every version of this and knows exactly what to do. She told me the case was weak. She told me to gather documentation. She told me not to call my father. What I did not expect was what came next. My half-brother started talking. Not to me. To people we had mutually known growing up. To my father's extended family. To anyone who would listen. The story he told was that I had manipulated an elderly man. That I had spent years carefully cultivating a relationship with my grandfather, specifically to cut out the rest of the family. That I was selfish and calculating, and that the person who'd always been on the outside looking in had finally found a way to use that position to her advantage. I found out about this through a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, who texted me one night with a screenshot and the message, "Thought you should see this?" I sat with that screenshot for a long time. Because the thing about being called a liar is that it follows you. It doesn't matter if the people who know you well don't believe it. There are always people who don't know you well, and those people sometimes make decisions based on what they've heard. My firm had a policy about conflicts of interest and professional reputation, and someone I never found out who sent an anonymous note to my supervisor. Nothing specific, just enough. My supervisor called me in. He was careful and professional, and he told me he was sure it was nothing, and I believed him that he believed that. But I also knew the note existed now. I knew it was in a file somewhere. I knew that when the next round of promotions came around, there would be a conversation I hadn't been part of where someone would say, "Didn't there used to be some kind of issue?" And that would be enough. I went home and I made a list. Constance had taught me to do that when things felt too large. Make a list. Make it specific, make it concrete. So I wrote down what I knew and what I could prove and what I needed. I knew my grandfather had been of sound mind. His physician could confirm that. I knew the timeline of the will. It had been updated 8 months before his death, when by all medical accounts he had been fully competent. I knew I had not had unusual access to him. His phone records, his calendar, the accounts of his neighbor and his regular card game group would all confirm that. I also knew something that nobody else knew yet. My grandfather had kept letters. He was from a generation that wrote things down, and he had written me letters. Actual letters, handwritten, mailed in envelopes with stamps. Every few months for most of my adult life. I had kept every one of them. There were 43 letters in a shoebox in my closet. In those letters, he told me about his life, his marriage to my grandmother, his regrets, his opinions on my father's choices, which were not always flattering, his grief over my mother. She had been his favorite daughter-in-law, he wrote once, and he wanted me to know that he had loved her too. In one letter, written about 2 years before he died, he wrote, "I have made provisions for you that I hope will reflect what I should have done for you long ago. You are the only one of the grandchildren who has asked me about my life instead of my net worth." I gave the letters to my attorney. She read them carefully. She made copies. She looked up at me and said, "These are going to matter." The case went to probate court. The process took 7 months, which is a long time to have something hanging over your life. I went to work every day. I did my job. I did not discuss any of it with colleagues. I called Constance on Sundays. I ran 3 miles on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because it was the only thing that reliably cleared my head. My father called twice during those 7 months. Both times he asked how I was. Both times I said, fine. Neither of us mentioned the court case. It was almost impressive, the ability we had developed over decades to not say the thing we meant. The hearing happened on a Thursday in October. The courtroom was small and fluorescent lit and smelled like industrial cleaner. My father and stepmother sat on the other side. My half-brother was there too. He looked young. I had forgotten how young he still was. My attorney was methodical. She entered the physician's documentation. She entered the timeline. She entered the card group testimony. 2 men in their 70s who had known my grandfather for 30 years and who had sat with him every Tuesday and who both stated clearly that he had been sharp, funny, and fully himself right up until his final months. She entered the letters. When the letters were entered, my father's attorney objected. There was a back and forth. The judge, an older woman with a careful voice, allowed them. I watched my father read one of the letters from across the room. I watched his face. He had not known they existed. The judge ruled in my favor. She ruled that there was no credible evidence of diminished capacity at the time the will was written, no evidence of undue influence, and that the contest had been filed without sufficient factual basis. She said it in the flat, procedural language of court findings, but I heard it the way it actually was. She believed me. Outside the courthouse, my attorney shook my hand and said, "Congratulations." She had files under her arm all ready for the next case. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the October air, and I did not feel triumphant exactly. I felt something more like settled. Like a weight that had been pressing on one specific spot in my chest had finally, after 7 months, moved. There were still things to deal with. The anonymous note to my supervisor was still in a file somewhere. The things my half-brother had said were still in the world, still rattling around in the corners of family gossip. My grandfather was still gone, and I had never gone to attend his funeral or say goodbye in any formal way. Because no one had called to tell me he had died. I thought about that for a long time. The not calling, the decision someone had made at some point that I did not need to know. It wasn't an accident or an oversight. You don't forget to call a grandchild when their grandfather dies. You decide not to. I wrote my father a letter. Not an angry one. That surprised even me when I started writing it. I wrote it calmly and I said clearly what I was saying. I was not going to have contact with him or his family going forward. Not because of the court case, not because of the inheritance, because of a pattern that was 20 years old and had never once changed. And I was 31 years old and I had run out of patience for waiting for it to. I said I didn't hate him. I said I thought he had probably told himself most of the time that he had done the best he could. I said I believed that he believes that. I also said that what someone believes about their own behavior and what that behavior actually did are two different things, and that I had spent enough of my life managing the distance between those two things so that he wouldn't have to. I mailed it. I sent it certified mail so I would know it arrived. He never wrote back. I had not expected him to. I had written it for me, not for a response. The following spring, I was promoted to project director. It was the promotion I had been working toward for 3 years. My supervisor announced it in a staff meeting, and afterward my colleagues took me to a bar down the street and we ordered appetizers and drinks, and someone gave a small, embarrassing speech that made everyone laugh. I thought about the note in the file. I thought about how whatever damage had been attempted had not, in the end, been enough. The inheritance settled through my grandfather's estate that same year. It was enough to pay off my student loans, which I did immediately, and to invest, and to put a down payment on a larger apartment with 2 bedrooms and a small room I turned into an office. The second bedroom has a good bed and a window that gets morning light. Constance stays in it when she visits. She visited in November and we went to a restaurant she'd read about and ordered too much food and talked for 3 hours. At some point she said, "You know he would have loved seeing you like this." She meant my grandfather. She had met him only a few times at family holidays, but she remembered him. I said I knew. She said, "I think he was trying with those letters. I think he was trying to make right something he'd felt bad about for a long time." I think so too. I'll never be able to ask him. I missed the funeral and I missed the chance to sit with him in his last months, and those are real losses, not small ones. There's a grief in that I still carry. I stopped expecting it to go away. But I have the letters. 43 of them in a shoebox in my office closet. I've read some of them so many times I have sentences memorized. You are the only one who has asked me about my life instead of my net worth. I think about that when the other things get loud, when I catch myself reviewing old conversations, looking for the moment I should have done something differently. When I wonder what might have been if my father had been a different kind of man. Then I come back to that sentence. I asked about his life. I was just being myself. I was just doing what felt natural, which was treating a person like a person. And somehow, that was the thing that lasted. I was not the child who got the graduation photos or the tearful goodbye at move-in day or the father who shook the hand of her first employer. I didn't get any of that. I got 2 empty seats in a gymnasium and a woman I'd never met taking my picture out of kindness. But I also got the Sunday calls from Constance. I got the letters. I got the October ruling in a small fluorescent courtroom. I got the promotion and the apartment with the good light and the office where I do work. I'm genuinely proud of. I got to become someone, on my own terms, without anyone's permission. That's not a consolation prize. That's the whole thing. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way you do when enough time has passed and you can finally look at a thing straight on without flinching. My father made a series of choices over 20 years. Small ones, mostly. Not calling when my grandfather died. Not showing up to a gymnasium in Pennsylvania. Not asking real questions. Not seeing me. Each choice by itself could be explained away. Busy, distracted, didn't think. But choices stack. They compound. And what they build over time is a record. Not the record he told himself he had, but the one that actually existed. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody likes to say out loud. It doesn't care about intentions. My father probably believed, most of the time, that he was a decent man doing his best, and maybe in some limited sense he was. But what he actually did, the consistent 20-year pattern of it, produced a daughter who drove to his house, heard what he wanted, said no, and then went home and built a life so complete that his absence stopped being a wound and started being just a fact. He created that outcome, not me, and my grandfather. I think about him too. He was not a perfect man. He was part of a family that had not treated me well, and he did not intervene in any visible way when it might have mattered. But he paid attention. He wrote letters. He asked himself at some point late in his life what the honest accounting looked like, and then he acted on it. That took something. Not courage exactly, but honesty. The willingness to look at what was true instead of what was comfortable. Constance did that too, every Sunday for years. She called. She asked. She remembered. It was not complicated, and it was not dramatic. It was just consistent attention, the kind that tells another person, "You exist, I see you, you matter to me." I don't think she knew how much those calls held me up. I should tell her that more. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that character is just the accumulation of small decisions. The decision to call or not call. To show up or not show up. To write a letter or stay silent. None of those moments feel like much when they're happening, but they are the whole thing in the end. They are what people are made of. I worked hard, yes. I was disciplined, and I kept going when I wanted to stop, and I didn't let what happened to me become a reason to become small. But I also want to be honest, I didn't do that through willpower alone. I did it because Constance showed me what it looked like to be consistent and present and real with another person. I learned integrity from watching her practice it. Not perfectly, just steadily. Noelle, the project director, Noelle with the apartment and the morning light and the office where I do work, I'm proud of. She exists because of choices too. Mine and other people's. That's the whole story, really. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about what any of it means. You become what you consistently do, and the people around you become, in part, what you consistently give them. My father gave me absence. Constance gave me presence. The difference between those two things is my entire life.